Silence never scared me until that night. In my winter cabin, I was seeking solitude to escape the noise of my past. But when I noticed the first footprints in the snow leading to my home, the silence suddenly became suffocating. No sound of wind, no rustle of the forest, nothing. And then the strange knocking started, followed by footsteps in the cellar. I'll never forget what happened next. That night changed everything. Do you want to know what lurks in that eerie silence? Then listen closely. Just don't make the same mistake I did. The first thing I noticed that night was the quiet. Not the ordinary kind of quiet you'd expect in the dead of winter, but a profound, suffocating silence that seemed to absorb every sound. No wind, no hum of distant traffic, not even the faint rustle of tree branches, just an all-encompassing stillness that pressed against my ears like cotton. Let me back up a bit. My name is Ethan. I'm 29 years old, recently divorced, and living in a rental cabin in the middle of nowhere. After my marriage ended, I couldn't stand staying in the city with all its noise and memories, so I packed up my life and moved to the mountains of Vermont. It was supposed to be temporary, a way to clear my head and figure out my next steps. The cabin wasn't much, just two small bedrooms, a living area, and a kitchen that barely fit the essentials, but it had a fireplace, a decent view of the woods, and, most importantly, isolation. That was what I thought I needed. Space to breathe and think without the distractions of modern life. For the first few weeks, it worked. I'd wake up to the sun glinting off the snow-covered pines, spend my days reading or chopping wood, and fall asleep to the crackle of the fire. Peaceful, simple, exactly what I wanted. But then the quiet started. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, the kind of thing you wouldn't even register unless you were looking for it. The wind stopped blowing as often, the usual creaks and groans of the cabin grew infrequent, and the forest seemed less alive. No bird song, no scurrying of animals, nothing. Just me and the sound of my own breathing. I tried to brush it off. It was winter after all. Maybe the animals were hibernating, and the still air was just a quirk of the season. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. Something felt off. Like the silence wasn't natural, but imposed. Then came the footprints. One morning, I stepped outside to grab firewood and noticed a single line of footprints leading from the woods to my front porch. They were deep and deliberate, the kind of impressions a person would make walking in heavy boots. But there was only one set, and they didn't lead away, just to the porch, stopping abruptly at the steps. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My first thought was that someone had come to the cabin during the night, maybe a hiker who got lost or a neighbor checking in. But I hadn't heard a knock or seen anyone, and the idea of someone walking through the woods in sub-zero temperatures without leaving any tracks behind them, it didn't make sense. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself I must have missed something. Maybe they'd backtracked carefully or the wind had blown the return prints away. It wasn't a great explanation, but it was better than admitting how uneasy it made me feel. That night, I double-checked all the locks and left the porch light on, just in case. The following days were uneventful, and I started to relax. I chalked the footprints up to my overactive imagination and the strange way the wilderness can play tricks on you when you're alone for too long. I even started to appreciate the quiet again. The air was crisp, the sky was clear, and the solitude felt more like a blessing than a curse. But that didn't last. It started with the snow. I woke up one morning to find the cabin surrounded by a fresh, undisturbed blanket of white, except for the same footprints. This time, there were more of them, circling the cabin in a haphazard pattern. They crisscrossed over themselves, weaving in and out between the trees, but never going too far from the building. And once again, they stopped abruptly at the porch. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the faint sound of my own breath fogging the icy air. I couldn't even hear my own footsteps as I backed inside and locked the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind outside made my stomach twist in knots. I kept thinking about those prints, about how they seemed so deliberate, so intentional. It was as if someone or something was trying to scare me, and it was working. I stayed up late, staring out the window at the snow-covered trees, half expecting to see a shadowy figure emerge. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off in the armchair by the fire. The next morning, I woke to find the cabin colder than it should have been. The fire had gone out, which wasn't unusual, but the draft that seemed to be sweeping through the room was. I checked the windows, still locked, the doors secure, but when I stepped outside, I found the footprints again. This time, they didn't just circle the cabin. They led to the side of the house, stopping directly beneath my bedroom window. Panic set in. Someone had been outside while I was asleep, close enough to look inside. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and the snowstorm that had rolled in overnight made driving impossible. I was alone. The rest of the day passed in a haze of paranoia. I kept the curtains drawn, jumping at every sound, every imagined shadow. By nightfall, I had barricaded the door with furniture and armed myself with the only weapon I could find, a rusty hatchet I used for splitting firewood. Around midnight, the knocking began. It was soft at first, almost polite. Just a gentle tap, tap, tap on the front door. My blood ran cold as I stared at the barricade, clutching the hatchet so tightly my knuckles ached. Then it stopped. A moment later, it started again, this time on the window. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to scream, but didn't dare make a sound. The knocking moved from one window to the next, a slow, deliberate pattern. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling the cabin. Finally, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I sat there, trembling, waiting for the next sound, the next knock, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a faint creak, like the sound of a door hinge groaning under pressure. My stomach dropped as I realized what it was. The cellar. I had forgotten about the cellar door. It was on the side of the cabin, covered in snow, and I hadn't opened it since moving in. But now I could hear its slow, heavy footsteps climbing the stairs from below. They reached the top, paused for what felt like an eternity, and then began moving toward the living room. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I gripped the hatchet. My eyes locked on the barricaded door, waiting for it to burst open, but it never did. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the cabin was empty. The cellar door was still bolted shut from the inside, and there were no signs of anyone else. But the footprints in the snow told a different story. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. And they weren't alone. There were dozens of them, all heading in the same direction, as if something had been waiting for me to notice before leaving. I left the cabin the next day and never looked back. People say winter is a time for stillness, for rest and reflection, but I've learned the truth. Winter is when the silence watches you, and sometimes it knocks. They say the cold gets to you in stages. First, it stings, then it burns, and finally, when you've been out in it long enough, it numbs you entirely. I learned this the hard way during a drive I'll never forget or forgive myself for. My name's Mike, and I work as a courier for a small logistics company in upstate New York. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. I've always liked driving. There's something about the solitude of the open road that clears my head. Or at least, I used to think so. That winter, work had been relentless. The holidays always ramp things up, but this year, a massive storm had backed up deliveries for weeks. By the time New Year's rolled around, everyone was scrambling to catch up. So when my boss called me in on January 2nd for a long-haul delivery, I didn't think twice. It's an easy route, he said. Just a few hours north to drop off a package. You'll be back by nightfall. I wish I had refused. The day started off uneventfully. I loaded the van with the package, just a small, unmarked box, and set off around noon. The snow had let up overnight, leaving a thick white blanket over everything. The roads were mostly clear, though, and I even caught glimpses of sunlight breaking through the clouds. For a while, it felt peaceful. As I headed further north, the scenery grew more desolate. The trees lining the highway became denser, their snow-laden branches forming a tunnel around the road. The occasional farmhouse or gas station became rarer, until it was just me, the van, and miles of untouched wilderness. That's when I noticed the silence. At first, I chalked it up to the van's insulation. The hum of the engine had always drowned out most external noise, but this felt different. It was like the world outside had been muted. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic. just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the windows. I turned on the radio, hoping for some music to break the tension, but all I got was static. Even the emergency weather channel, which always came through, was silent. My phone had no signal, either not unusual for this area, but it added to the growing unease. Still, I told myself to relax. It was just another delivery. A few more hours, and I'd be back in my apartment heating up leftovers and watching bad TV. Then I saw the figure. It appeared out of nowhere, standing at the edge of the road just beyond a bend. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the icy pavement. As the van came to a stop, I got a better look at them. It was a man dressed in a heavy coat and scarf, his face obscured by a hood. He wasn't waving or signaling for help, just standing there motionless, as if waiting for me. I rolled down the window a crack. "Hey, you okay?" No response. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch at the sound of my voice. The longer I looked at him, the more wrong he seemed. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like he was frozen in place. A chill ran down my spine. Something about him, about the way he just stood there, made my instincts scream to keep driving. But I couldn't shake the nagging thought that he might be in trouble. What if his car had broken down? What if he was stranded out here? I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out of the van. The air was biting, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache with every breath. I approached the man slowly, my boots crunching in the snow. "Sir, do you need help?" Still nothing. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The snow around him was pristine, undisturbed. No footprints leading to where he stood, just an unbroken expanse of white. My pulse quickened. "Sir," my voice cracked as I raised the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim light. The man turned. I wish I could describe his face, but I can't, because there wasn't one. Just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of mask, but then I saw the way the light caught his skin, pale, waxy, and eerily seamless. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as if watching me. Or maybe it wasn't. How could it, without eyes? Panic set in, and I bolted back to the van, slipping on the icy road in my haste. I fumbled with the door, finally yanking it open and throwing myself inside. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, my hands trembling on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the figure remained where it was, growing smaller as I sped away. But even after it disappeared from view, the feeling of being watched lingered. I drove for what felt like hours, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. The snow began to fall again, heavy flakes swirling in the headlights and obscuring the road. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road, but the highway remained empty. Eventually, I saw the lights of a small diner up ahead. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the parking lot and killed the engine. The warmth of the diner was a welcome contrast to the cold, and the sight of other people laughing, eating, going about their lives helped calm my nerves. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, keeping an eye on the van. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the lot in white. For the first time all day, I felt a semblance of safety. That's when I noticed the footprints. They started at the edge of the lot, leading straight to the van. Deep, deliberate prints that hadn't been there when I parked. My stomach dropped as I followed the trail with my eyes. They circled the van once, twice, before stopping at the driver's side door. I couldn't breathe. The keys were in my pocket, and the van was locked. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. But as I stared at those footprints, a terrible thought took root in my mind. What if they weren't outside anymore? The coffee turned cold in my hands as I sat there, paralyzed by fear. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone still had no signal, and the payphone in the corner was out of order. The other diners seemed oblivious, chatting and laughing as if nothing was wrong. Finally, I summoned the courage to leave. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the van, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The footprints were fresh, the edges sharp and defined. Whoever or whatever had made them couldn't be far. I unlocked the door and climbed inside, my breath visible in the freezing air. The interior was empty, just as I'd left it, but the feeling of unease remained, prickling at the back of my neck. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, determined to finish the delivery and get the hell out of there. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. The figure was sitting in the back seat. I swerved off the road, the van skidding to a stop in a snowbank. When I turned around, the back seat was empty, but I knew what I'd seen. My hands shook as I floored the gas, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. The rest of the drive was a blur. By the time I reached the drop-off point, a nondescript warehouse in the middle of nowhere, it was well past midnight. I left the package on the loading dock, not caring about signatures or protocols, and sped away without looking back. That was 2 months ago. I quit my job the next day and moved back to the city, hoping to lose myself in the noise and chaos. But the silence has followed me. Every so often, I'll catch a glimpse of footprints in the snow, leading to my apartment door, or hear a soft knock in the dead of night. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me. All I know is that the cold isn't the only thing that gets to you in stages. First, it stings, then it burns, and finally, it takes you. You ever hear something you can't explain? Not just a noise, but something that burrows into your mind and refuses to let go. No matter how much you tell yourself it's nothing, that's what happened to me last winter. I've been trying to forget it, but the sound keeps coming back, especially on nights when the air is still and the snow is thick. The strangest part is, I can't even explain it fully. All I know is that I'll never step into the woods again, not in winter, not alone. My name's Rachel. I work as a freelance photographer, mostly nature and landscape shots. It's not as glamorous as it sounds, but it pays the bills, and I've always loved being outdoors. I live in a small town up in Vermont, where winters are long and brutal, but the snowy forests make for incredible photos. Last January, I got a call from a local magazine asking for a winter-themed photo essay. They wanted a series on the stark beauty of the woods after a heavy snowfall. I was thrilled, finally, a chance to do something meaningful with my work. So, I packed my camera gear, dressed in layers, and headed out early one morning to a trail I'd been meaning to explore. The forecast had warned of a storm coming in later that day, but I figured I'd be done before it hit. The trail started out easy, winding through a pine forest so dense that the sunlight barely filtered through. Everything was quiet except for the crunch of my boots in the snow and the occasional rustle of branches above. I felt at peace, immersed in the stillness, snapping photos of frost-covered trees and icicles hanging like daggers from the branches. About an hour in, I veered off the main trail. It wasn't intentional at first, just a gradual drift as I followed a line of trees that looked particularly photogenic. By the time I realized I'd left the path, I figured I'd just keep going a little further. The snow was light, and I could easily retrace my steps. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to make me stop. A soft, rhythmic sound, like someone tapping on wood. At first, I thought it might be a woodpecker, but it didn't have the same sharp cadence. This was slower, deliberate, almost human. I stood still, listening. The sound stopped. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing unusual, just endless rows of snow-covered trunks disappearing into the distance. "Hello?" I called out, feeling silly as soon as the word left my mouth. My voice seemed to die in the dense air, swallowed by the snow. Silence. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just some branch swaying in the wind, and kept walking. The further I went, the stranger things became. The trees seemed to close in, their branches intertwining overhead like a canopy. The snow felt deeper here, heavier, and my footsteps were the only noise breaking the oppressive quiet. Then I saw the footprints. They weren't mine, too small, like a child's. They meandered aimlessly through the snow, crossing over each other as if whoever made them had been walking in circles. "Maybe someone else wandered off the trail," I muttered, though my voice felt out of place in the stillness. But something about the prints bothered me. They were too fresh, the edges sharp and undisturbed, yet I hadn't seen or heard anyone nearby. I thought about turning back, but the light was perfect for photos, and the magazine deadline loomed in my mind. So I kept going, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The tapping sound came again, louder this time. It echoed faintly through the trees, pulling my gaze in every direction. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to move, shifting from one side to the other like a taunt. "Hello?" I called again, my voice tinged with unease. Is someone there? No answer. Then, a shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I spun around, my heart hammering. There was nothing there, just the trees standing silent and unyielding. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my camera. Photography always calmed me, and I forced myself to frame a shot of a gnarled tree trunk draped in snow. Through the viewfinder, I caught a flicker of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. My hands froze. I lowered the camera, scanning the forest, but there was nothing there. Pull it together, Rachel, I whispered, trying to laugh. You're just scaring yourself. The tapping came again, closer this time. I don't know when the fear started to turn into panic. Maybe it was when I realized the footprints I'd been following were no longer in front of me, they were behind me. Or when I noticed my own tracks had vanished, swallowed by the falling snow. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but the landscape looked different. The trees seemed taller, their branches gnarled and twisted like claws reaching for the sky. The light had changed too, dimming unnaturally fast, as if the sun was being smothered by the clouds. I quickened my pace, trying to stay calm, but the tapping followed me, growing louder, more insistent. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree, its bark blackened and rough. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was a door, an old wooden door, standing upright in the middle of the forest with no frame, no wall, just a door. Its surface was weathered, the paint peeling, and a rusty handle jutted out from one side. My first instinct was to run, but curiosity held me in place. What was it doing here? Who had put it there? The tapping came again, now unmistakably coming from the other side. Hello? I called, my voice trembling. No response. I took a step closer, then another. The snow around the door was undisturbed, as if it had been placed there just moments ago. My hand reached out, almost on its own. The metal handle was ice cold beneath my fingers. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But something about the door, about the rhythmic tapping, drew me in like a moth to a flame. I turned the handle and pulled. The forest went silent. Behind the door was nothing, not darkness, not another side of the forest, just a void, a vast, endless expanse of white that seemed to stretch forever. And then I saw them, shapes, faint at first, but growing clearer. Figures moving in the distance, their forms shifting and indistinct. They were coming closer, their steps slow and deliberate. The tapping started again, louder now, echoing from the void. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran. I don't know how long or how far, I just ran, the forest blurring around me. The tapping followed, relentless, chasing me through the trees. When I finally burst back onto the main trail, I collapsed, my chest heaving. The sound was gone. The forest was still. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, when the snow is falling and the world is quiet, I hear it again, the tapping. I don't think I'll ever look at snow the same way again. For most of my life, winter had been my favorite season, the crisp air, the quiet crunch of snow underfoot, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. But now, I dread it. Winter is no longer a season, it's a ghost that haunts me. It began last December, on what should have been an ordinary evening. My name is Ryan, by the way. I'm 32, single, and I work as a freelance graphic designer. Most of my time is spent staring at a screen in my small apartment, sipping coffee until it's too late to sleep, and then wondering why I'm so tired the next morning. It's not an exciting life, but it's mine. That night, though, something was different. I had spent most of the day working on a client project and was finally ready to unwind. I looked outside. It had been snowing heavily for hours. My neighborhood was blanketed in white, the streetlights casting a warm amber glow over the frozen landscape. It was nearly midnight when I decided to take a walk. I had this habit of wandering the neighborhood at night when the world felt too heavy. There was something calming about the solitude of it, especially in the snow. Everything was so still. I bundled up, pulling on my heavy coat, scarf, and gloves, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't mind. I liked the way it made me feel alive. My breath fogged the air as I walked, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the icy sidewalk. The streets were empty. Not a single car passed, and no one else seemed foolish enough to be out in this weather. It was perfect, or so I thought. About 15 minutes into my walk, I started to notice something strange. The street lights were flickering not all at once, but one by one as I approached them. At first, I thought it was just an electrical issue, but the pattern was too deliberate. When I stopped, the lights stopped flickering. When I moved, the next one would dim, then brighten again as I passed under it. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the snow was causing some interference. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned a corner onto a side street, hoping the unease would fade, but it only got worse. The houses here were older, their windows dark. The snow muffled everything, and the silence was oppressive. I had this creeping sensation at the back of my neck, like eyes were boring into me. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint at first, barely visible in the falling snow, but as I followed the path, they became clearer. The strange thing was, they weren't mine. They were too far ahead, and I hadn't seen anyone else outside. I stopped and looked around, but there was no one in sight. The footprints continued down the street, leading toward an empty park. I told myself to turn back, to go home, but something compelled me to keep going. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stupidity. The park was eerie in the dark, the swings and slides coated in snow, motionless. The footprints led to a bench near the center, and then they stopped. There was no sign of anyone sitting there, no disturbance in the snow. Just a clean, perfect line of footprints that ended abruptly. I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. My breath quickened, fogging up in the cold air. I turned around, ready to leave, when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the park, half hidden in the shadows. I froze. It was hard to make out any details, but they weren't moving. Just standing there, watching me. I wanted to call out, to ask if they were okay, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and walked away as calmly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to run. Running would make it real. As I left the park, I glanced back and the figure was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and the snow. By the time I reached my apartment, I had almost convinced myself. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it, and sat down to catch my breath. That's when I heard the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they wanted to be there. I stared at the door, my body frozen. Another knock, louder this time. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my phone and checked the peephole. There was no one there, but the knocking continued. For the next hour, I sat in my living room, clutching my phone, listening to the steady, rhythmic knocking. It wasn't frantic or aggressive, just persistent. Eventually, it stopped. The silence was worse. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the apartment, every gust of wind outside made me jump. By the time the sun came up, I felt like a zombie. The next day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on work, to pretend everything was normal, but my nerves were shot. Every time I glanced at the door, I half expected to see it swing open on its own. That evening, the snow started again, heavier than before. I told myself I wouldn't go outside, but something drew me to the window. The street was empty, just like the night before. And then I saw them, the footprints. They started at the curb in front of my building, leading directly to my door. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and bolted. I didn't care that it was freezing outside or that I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get away. I wandered the streets for hours, unsure of where to go. My mind was racing, filled with worst-case scenarios. Eventually, I ended up at a diner on the edge of town. It was nearly empty, just me and the waitress behind the counter. I ordered coffee, trying to steady my shaking hands. When the waitress brought my cup, she gave me a strange look. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I lied. "You've got snow on your back," she said, frowning. "Like you fell or something." I hadn't fallen. My stomach dropped as I realized what she was saying. Snow on my back. As if someone had touched me. I never went back to my apartment. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is that winter no longer feels safe. Snow doesn't just hold footprints, it holds memories too. And some things are better left forgotten.